Welcome. Well, welcome to our fifth podcast on our year in reading through the Bible at Trinity Church. I'm Pastor Matt, and I have with me today Pastor Mike. So, Pastor Mike, what is the purpose of this podcast, and what do we hope people get out of it?
Yeah, so we are doing Bible in a year, in which we're taking the entire story of the Bible and trying to read it as a community in little chunks, knowing that the Bible is many books with many different voices, but all one story that ends up leading to Jesus. And so we are endeavoring to take this journey because we know that being daily in Scripture strengthens us and helps our faith. It continues to bring us closer into relationship with God and helps inform the way that we live with others. So thank you for all of you guys that have taken on this challenge with us.
Yeah. So as he said, thanks for being a part of this and reading along. And even if you've fallen behind, jumping back in with us. So today is Fat Tuesday.
Mardi Gras.
Yeah. Which we just got done eating at Olive Garden, and
we're very full on breadsticks.
Very full on breadsticks. Yeah. So it was excellent. So hope you get to enjoy Fat Tuesday. And as we read this week, Leviticus chapter 3, verse 16, all fat is the Lord's, is what it says.
Ooh, there's a lot of me for the Lord right now. It's
so
good.
What an odd
yeah, right. What an odd scene.
So let's, because of that though, and tomorrow is Ash Wednesday. We begin Lent. I hope you're going to join us if you're in the area to come join us for Ash Wednesday at 6:00 here at Trinity, and receive ashes on your head as a reminder of dust you came from and dust you will return. But with the whole concept of Fat Tuesday, let's talk food a little bit. So what is your favorite restaurant, favorite food? And do you have any food oddities?
Ooh, very good questions. Well, Culver's ends up getting way too much of my family's money that we love, a good burger, good chicken sandwich, and custard. Can't beat it, man. It's so good.
And Wisconsin from
Wisconsin. So coming from Wisconsin, they were everywhere. We had one less than a mile from our house, so too many visits there. My favorite food is probably burritos. I love making, cilantro rice and a good type of protein, cheese, vegetables, you name it. Good burrito bowl is really great. And my food oddity is that I don't really like sour cream. Anything with like sour cream or mayonnaise, no thanks.
I get that. So, yeah.
How about you?
My wife would tell you I have way too many food oddities because I am extremely picky. But my biggest food oddity is honestly texture. Anything that's an odd texture, and this is my problem with bananas. Bananas may be the worst texture ever created in all of anything. God may have made a mistake with it. Let's just go with that.
Wow. You heard it here first, guys.
Bananas.
God made a mistake with bananas.
So gross. But favorite restaurant, it would probably be a burger place. Right now, I'm kind of obsessed with what is it called over here? Chard. That's it. Chard. Ooh. I love Chard. The I'm not going to say it right. Wagyu burgers, but Sicky's burgers. But the go-to is definitely Bob's Bar, Martinsburg, Nebraska. Largest hamburgers, a full half-pound, gigantic. But the key is the cheese balls with it, the cheese curds. Oh. It's like a plate that's like this big. And, you're hurting. You can't breathe. Your lungs, the cheese is under your lungs. So
burgers at Bob's Bar that's really fun to say.
Yep. Well, that's for food. So share with us your favorite restaurant, food oddities. Who else hates bananas? Ken, I know you do.
Yeah, so as we get into our readings for this week, our cafe drink winner from last week was Michelle. So comment, and maybe you'll be next week's winner.
Yeah, Michelle Tressmer. So
Tressmer.
Don't forget to get your cafe drink. So, and thanks for commenting. So let's dive in now to Exodus chapter 22 to Leviticus chapter 4.
Yeah, and let's give some encouragement to all of you guys who made it through this week's reading. It was a lot of very dense reading about the tabernacle and about the Ark of the Covenant and how that was to be constructed, and a lot of laws as well. And so if you've made it this far, you're doing great. We're going to get back to narrative, but Leviticus, as we get into that, these are the specific laws for the priests. And so some of them are going to make you scratch your head, but that's what we're here for, is to help you unpack what they mean and how they apply to us today.
And this particular section that we read today, I'm trying to think of like what personality type is like reading this and being like all in, like this is awesome, because there's not a lot of narrative.
There's not a lot of narrative. Yeah.
But so I'm thinking like construction majors, maybe like, oh yeah, detail, the person that's sitting there. Like it is. So we want to just acknowledge this is a difficult section. So great job sticking with it. Do the best you can to kind of keep walking into it. And if you're struggling with it, lean into the Psalms all the more this week.
Some really good Psalms.
There is some really good Psalms that we were doing.
The 20s they're all bangers.
Yeah. So with that, the whole kind of concept of what we're doing in this reading plan is one story that leads to Jesus. That's the actual name of it from Bible Project. So Pastor Mike, let's summarize what we see starting in Exodus 22.
Yeah, and we kind of read up through 24 last week, but we didn't get time to unpack 22 through 24, which introduces a lot of laws related to social justice, focusing on restitution when there are disagreements between neighbors, protection of property, and just how we are supposed to treat each other well. And so it reveals God's concern for justice and how his people are to reflect his character in their relationships with one another. And so once you get into 23 and 24, you get receiving the covenant relationship between God and his people. And the Ark of the Covenant is first mentioned as Moses and the Israelites prepare for a deeper and more sacred relationship with God.
Now in Exodus 23, really random.
Yeah.
You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. So if you've been doing this,
God doesn't want you to.
This is kind of the thing. I think when I read through this section, this is what keeps my attention, is the really random oddities.
Yeah.
And so I might bring up a few like that, because there are just certain things that's like, ooh, it's talking about goat curtains. Like, okay, let's talk about goat curtains and the length of the goat curtains.
Yeah.
I don't actually have goat curtains, so
Yeah, me neither.
But if you are boiling a young goat in its mother's milk, please stop, please.
Yeah, got to change your dinner plans.
So Exodus 24, though.
Yep. So
24 and then 25.
And 25, we receive the Ark of the Covenant.
Yeah.
And so we get detailed instructions from God on how he wants that constructed. Everything down to the types of metals to be used in it, whether that's gold or bronze, and even down to the type of wood, which God really loves acacia wood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think if I have anything that's built out of acacia wood, or
I don't think so.
Like,
I don't know.
I'm really drawn to hickory. That's the wood choice I typically make. I don't know. But it's like I was kind of thinking of this in terms of like Chip and Joanna Gaines type of show. Like when that was really, really, really popular, everybody was like, hey, we're going to shiplap everything. But God's like, it's the year for acacia. Like everything's being built out of acacia wood. So.
Well, and I think that it is telling that, God was very specific on what kind of wood he wanted to use. So I think it's no surprise that when he came to earth in Jesus' form, he came as the son of a carpenter.
Yes, there we go.
It's very specific.
Clear Exodus connection.
Yep. Pointing to Jesus. That's what we're all about here.
We're going to probably talk a little bit more about Ark of the Covenant here in a little bit. We get into Exodus 26, the description of the tabernacle. This is where we hear about the goat hair curtains.
Yep.
So would love to hear if anybody has goat hair curtains. Take a picture, send it to us. Then we get into Exodus 27, building the altar. And then 28 is priest garments, Aaron, the Levites. And these are all more descriptions, though, because later we have the actual making of them.
Yeah, and so it's interesting that their origin story comes after describing what kind of garments they're going to wear, which is interesting. But it is important to remember going forward that the Levites come from the tribe of Levi, which is one of the 12 sons of Jacob. And the Levites still exist as an order in Jesus's day. And so when Jesus makes reference in stories to a Levite, he is talking about somebody who manages the temple, somebody that is from this priestly class and line going forward. Probably most famous in the story of the Good Samaritan. Yeah. And so, you get lots of descriptions on what kind of garments they're supposed to wear, what kind of rituals, how they're supposed to sacrifice stuff, how they're supposed to tithe to one another or to the
there's
temple.
A census tax in the midst of the Exodus 30, the description of Sabbath.
Yeah, and so this is what's really interesting is that this description of Sabbath in Exodus that is very, very serious about not working at all, and also the harsh penalties that come with for working. You'll see a contrast later when we talk about the reason for the Sabbath in Deuteronomy, that in some ways Jesus ends up siding with Deuteronomy's understanding of what the purpose of the Sabbath is. So just keep that in mind as we get further into it.
Now, Exodus 32 is kind of interesting, and we actually did this as staff in our staff time this week. We focused on Exodus 32, the golden calf and Aaron.
Yeah. So this is our one narrative that kind of breaks up all of this other kind of laws and regulations, where you get this story in which Moses is talking with God. He's up on the mountain. And then while the people are waiting for 40 days, they start to get antsy. They're like, where's this guy Moses who led us out of Egypt? And where is our God who has been with us and protected us the whole time? Where did he go? And so the people are like, we want something to worship. And they go to Aaron, Moses' brother, and say, give us something to worship. And he says, well, give me all your gold and let's throw it in the fire. And he ends up shaping it into a calf, which is interesting that he says that Scripture does say that he formed it into the shape of a calf. And then later when he's talking to Moses and he's like, who did this? Moses confronts him and he's like, I don't know. I just kind of threw it in there and a calf came out.
Out it came.
Out it came. I don't know.
Exactly how you form things. Yeah. Is just the fire just threw it out at us and it was in the shape of a calf. Yeah.
Yeah, but this story is really interesting, and one of the things that I hope that we don't miss is that Moses ends up pacifying God's anger. That this is one of the top two things that God is like, don't do this. Don't make engraved images or idols to other creatures or gods to represent me. And so he gets super angry and he's ready to start over and be like, Moses, I'm going to take you and your line and I'm going to wipe out all everybody of these rebellious people. And Moses kind of bargains him out of it by saying, like, what would the world think of you if you had rescued your people from Egypt, then taken them out into the wilderness and destroyed them? Like, they would think that you were evil. And Moses successfully changes God's mind, which is a really interesting thing to think about.
Yeah. And then he also, after he uses that kind of language of what will the Egyptians think if your people all go and die out here, but then he says, remember
the covenant,
which is a really important, when you think of that word, remember your promises, God. Remember what you said. And God is reminded by Moses of his covenant with his people.
Yeah. And so then you end up getting more of this exchange between God and Moses, that Moses makes a request to God. He says, show me your glory. And God basically says, well, you can't actually look at me, but you can see where I've been. And so God passes by Moses, and basically Moses gets a look at his backside and where he's been. And it's really fascinating because he says, if you look directly at me, you will die.
Yeah. Like be consumed is kind of the... And we'll get to that when we get to the Ark of the Covenant, because we're going to talk Indiana Jones and his face is melting here,
right. But within it comes a very important verse, which is Exodus 34, 6 through 7, which is God's self-disclosure to Moses of saying, who am I and what am I like? And so it says that as the Lord passed before him and God proclaimed, Yahweh, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will be by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers and children's children to the third and fourth generations. And so we actually are going to study that.
Begins this Sunday.
This Sunday, God Has a Name will be our sermon series, and we'll be talking about each of those individual characteristics of God and how God has a specific personality and a specific character. And so
we'll get a sit in this pretty in-depth Exodus 34. So encourage you to come be a part of that. Sit in that passage. If you want, get the book as well. Buy the book. We'll try to post that in our comment section so you know what the book is if you'd like to read it as we're going through it over the next several weeks. So
God Has a Name by John Mark Comer. So
Exodus 35, we move out of the narrative into the actual construction now. All the details on the front end. This is how to build. Now we're going to build it.
Actually build it.
And it basically repeats, right?
It does kind of repeat itself, but there's this guy, Bezalel, who is a huge player. He's a master craftsman, and he is in charge of the construction of the tabernacle and the altar and also the construction of priestly garments. And so he becomes a really important player in making sure that all of these important rites, rituals, and locations to the Jewish faith come into being. And so, so cool guy. And then he just disappears from the narrative as soon as everything is made. So, sometimes scripture is just like that, where guys come, they have a really important role for one thing, and then they disappear.
And then we get into what we have summarized in our quick notes is 36, 37, 38. More construction, more construction, more construction. So Exodus 39, making the priestly garment. So this is the detail from the previous chapters, now the actual making of it. And then Exodus 40, the tabernacle is actually erected. So we had the description before, and it says the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle.
And this idea of God being with his people is really important. That most gods stayed way far away from the people, and they had to go up mountains like Moses did to go commune with their gods, or they needed to travel far distances. What's really unique about Yahweh is that he desires to be amongst his people. And this again is one of the things that points to Jesus, that over and over the story is that God comes to us rather than us going to God. And so when Jesus comes in the incarnation, this is just another part of God's story of him coming to us.
And that's the whole, it's a theological understanding of, but it's reality that God is the mover. God is the initiator, the one that moves towards us rather than, because so much of religion seeks this idea that I have to work my way to God. But the Christian faith is quite literally, no, God is the first mover. He is the one that initiates and creates faith within us. And we'll get into that as we dive deeper into further scripture, but it's a really important piece of what we're talking all about in our faith. So
and then the last thing, Leviticus 1 through 4, is a lot of the regulations around how offerings are supposed to be given and received and prepared and all of those sorts of things. And so we'll get into that a little bit more this next week. But
laws, rules for all sorts of things. So, and Leviticus can be a pretty difficult read.
It can be.
So, and it's going to begin with these regulations, things like that. But it's really pointing us to ultimately the ultimate sacrifice of Jesus.
So it's talking about all these other different types of sacrifices, and that sacrificial system ends with Jesus being the ultimate sacrifice.
So that's the summary. So the hard part for this week, honestly, was what do we really focus in on? Because there's a lot of law and a lot of detail.
Yeah.
So where do we begin? Do we begin with the sorcerer, death to sorcerers? There's some oddities. Bestiality is in this, and it mentions conversation around. It has this weird thing where it says, don't seduce a virgin, length of goat curtains, and then obviously the acacia thing. There's just a lot of like one-line oddities that we keep running into. So let's talk, though, about the law.
Yeah, and I think some of it, hopefully you recognize where some of these passages have seeped into our pop culture in some ways. That when I was growing up, there was a big movement of Christians against the Harry Potter books.
Yeah.
Partly because of this suspicion of sorcery. And this is where it comes from, is basically saying God does not like sorcerers, and so to even read something like that is not good.
Wait till we get to Saul.
Yeah.
King Saul
Yeah.
outlaws it and then visits it.
Yeah, so it is crazy how much detail is given to follow the law. And in some ways, I think it reminds me of, like, if you've ever been out in public and you see a really weird sign and you're like, who did something so stupid as to, like, stick their hand into the piranha, like, tank or something like that at the zoo, and somebody had to be like, let's put a sign saying don't stick your hand in the piranha tank.
Yeah.
And a lot of these laws are constructed to help keep the people safe, to regulate their behavior with one another, and also to help set them apart in their relationship with God.
Yeah.
But often we as people, we just have a natural tendency to want to follow the letter of the law and not necessarily always the heart or the spirit of the law. And so you see over and over that religious people sometimes take it too far, and they make even more rules that surround the rules until they become a burden rather than something that ends up setting us free to live in harmony with each other and with God.
And there's kind of a dual problem there, is because the Pharisees took that law and then added more detail and more rule upon rule upon rule upon rule, and it wasn't the heart of the law. But also there's the reality of us as people is, how close to the line can I get?
Yeah.
Like, that's how we always live, is like, how can it, so you said here is the line, so I can go touch the line, right? Or do I have to stay on this side of it? Like, I want to know exactly. And that's just how we function. And so we can understand the Pharisees, why they felt like they had to actually detail out some of this.
Yeah, because certainly those of you that are parents know that kids will try to find every loophole, and they will try to push the boundaries of whatever you tell them to do. And so it, in some ways, the ways that the Pharisees interact with people is that they are kind of like a parent who keeps having to clarify of like, stop touching me, and being like, no, just keep your hands to yourself, and like put your hands in your pockets. And you're like, why do I have to put my hands in my pockets? Well, it's because you were invading somebody else's space and you couldn't keep your hands to yourself. So like, that's a really in-depth analogy of what's going on with a lot of these things.
It's Finding Nemo. Nemo and the boat.
Yeah.
Don't touch the butt.
Yeah. Yeah. But the big thing and the relationship that we have to Jesus is that Jesus and the Pharisees end up navigating some of these laws, and Jesus reinterprets what it means to follow these laws really well, because many of the Pharisees tried to hold people to the letter of the law and created burdens in people's lives, and following the law came without mercy. But then Jesus tried to help people understand the heart of the law, which helped them bring them back into right relationship with God and each other.
So law and gospel is a major distinction, and that's we'll probably dive into that many times as we walk through this series through the year. So maybe we'll leave it as what we've left it at right now, but we'll identify and describe out this law gospel distinction as we go. So let's talk about what is my favorite movie. Honestly, it is Lord of the Rings is my favorite series by far, and I'm obsessed with Lord of the Rings. But Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade is my favorite movie. Ooh. We have to jump to the first one, which is also very good, which is Indiana Jones. And do you remember the name of it? The first one, Indiana Jones and the Ark of the Covenant.
Uh-huh.
So we're talking about Ark of the Covenant. So, and what happens in Indiana Jones, and how accurate is it?
Well, so you get the Nazis who end up stealing the Ark of the Covenant, and then they assume that there is treasure in there, and they're going to open it up. And when they do, their faces get melted off, and
because you cannot be in the presence of God is really the concept of it.
Yeah.
But they're seeking power. They're seeking all these things out of it. How can we control the world? And ultimately, it comes to this point in the movie where their faces melt off. But it is a biblical dynamic of the very conversation that Moses is happening of that you can't be in my presence.
Yeah, you can only watch where I've been and not see my face directly.
Yeah, so which is an important distinction. Now, funny story with the Ark of the Covenant. So kids ministry did this thing where they were walking around with the Ark of the Covenant, which was like two kids holding pool noodles, and then they had a box sitting on top. And I come out from worship, and they start to tip the box. They're walking through the commons, and the box tips off, and the kid grabs at it. And I'm like, "No, you haven't read this part yet, have you? you're going to be dropping to death."
Right, because one of our weird stories that we encounter with the Ark of the Covenant is somebody tries to catch it as it's falling,
trying to be helpful,
and ends up losing their life because he touches it when he's not supposed to. It's a weird story.
So Moses is very much of a central theme throughout all of this. The Ark of the Covenant. Let's jump. We talked a little bit about Exodus 34 already.
Yeah.
Give us a preview of the sermon series. What is it you're going to be sharing? What is the kind of key theme things that we're going to be walking into with this Exodus 34, 6 through 8? God has a name.
So the title kind of gives away the main points, is that God has a name, that God is not an energy, God is not just a force, but God is a person. Yeah. And God has a personality that goes along with his personhood and reveals that to his people. And I think sometimes in our brokenness as human beings, we like to refashion God in our own image, that God becomes an image of who we want God to be, rather than us learning and conforming to the character of God. And so as we dig into this series that is focused around Exodus 34, 6 through 8, we're really going to be talking about those specific characteristics that God self-discloses about himself, and then talk about how that's reflected in Jesus, and then how we reflect that in our lives as well.
Awesome.
So,
and that's kind of an interesting picture when we think about that Exodus 32, when we're talking about that they were trying to form a God in their own image, and which was a calf. We need something to worship. Aaron, give us something. But yet, really, we always do that ourselves too. We're always trying to take who God is and form him into what we want him to be. And
because one of the things that we pass over is, no pun intended, with Exodus story, but is that in the story of the golden calf, they name the calf Yahweh, which is God's name. Like, that's in the Hebrew. And so they say, this calf right here, this is Yahweh. And Yahweh's like, that's not me. That ain't me. Yeah. And so he's constantly trying to bring people back into an understanding of who he actually is, that he is compassionate and gracious. He is slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, and that he is forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. And so these are the characteristics that create the foundation for understanding God as merciful and compassionate, full of justice and faithfulness. And so
now the last theme I want to have us step into just a little bit before we close out is really what we see in this also is this kind of understanding of the glory of God and Moses' encounter with God. And that's what the Ark of the Covenant, and even when we're talking and joking about Indiana Jones and the Nazis, like that's part of this understanding of the glory of God that kind of runs throughout Exodus and Leviticus, God manifesting himself, his glory being revealed, and what is the glory of God, and what does that mean for us when we're having this conversation and thinking of Exodus, Leviticus, and the rest of Scripture?
Yeah, I think it would be very easy to read these passages and assume that God has a certain amount of vanity, that he wants things constructed in a certain way with fancy gold and wood and bronze, and it had to be to these specific specifications. But in some ways, God is trying to help people have the appreciation for the glory and the kind of have a certain amount of reverence that can only be reflected in these sort of human items. And it's interesting that people have to give up their own attachment to wealth to then be able to honor God, knowing that it is not like God did not intend for them to hoard up all of these things, but yet these things are there to glorify God.
Yeah. Well, there was a lot in these chapters that we walked through. And as we said before, we hope that you're able to walk through them, even in the difficult pieces of it, because we acknowledge this section is not the easiest read. So stick with it, do the best you can. We encourage you, comment, and feel free to ask questions. The first couple of weeks, I know we had several questions of people just asking different things related. We would love for you guys to ask questions about what you're reading. But comment so that you can win a free drink at the cafe here at Trinity Cafe. And
start the conversation.
Yeah. Let us know what's interesting as well. If you discover random things, I love random things in Scripture that are just like little oddities and you don't notice them every time. So when you come across them, let us know what you see. So
all right.
That's all we got today. So
thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
See you at Ash Wednesday, hopefully.